California is one of the most regulated states here in America. And with some 200 plus regulatory agencies, if you're planning to build a project here in California, chances are you're going to deal with many of these agencies. So in this video, we're going to answer some of the questions such as what agencies are involved on a building project and what other laws and requirements are triggered outside of just your building and zoning codes. And where do I begin with all of this? You see, the answers to those questions can have huge implications on your project in terms of time and money. So in this video, we're going to discuss what some of these unknowns are and how to uncover these unknowns early in a project. My name is Sarah, and I'm a licensed architect here in California. On this channel, we've talked about building codes, we've talked about zoning codes, and I'll put a link to those here, and they'll also be in the description below. However, what I want to talk to you about in this video is this additional set of rules, these extra rules, if you want to call them, that add on to a building project here in California. And to understand what some of these rules are, we're going to have to take a brief trip back to 4th or 5th grade, where we learn all about how laws are created. In our system of jurisprudence, laws stem from many complementary but distinct sources. At the highest level, we have the Constitution of the United States. Statutes are passed by federal, state, or local legislative bodies. Then we have administrative rules and regulations, and these are developed to implement these statutes. And finally, interpretations of statutes, regulations, and contracts on a case-by-case basis by courts and administrative agencies. There are two branches of statutory law. The first is civil law, and the second is criminal law. An architect or a client, their most common legal interactions have to do with usually administrative laws and regulations that are developed to implement civil statutes or public policy. An example of administrative laws, as we've talked about on this channel, includes building codes and zoning regulations. By adhering to these codes, you're adhering to administrative laws and by default, civil statutes. Agencies are involved to provide services, administer and enforce laws through building codes and zoning regulations. These agencies can be at the federal level, state, regional, and even local levels. Of course, this all depends on your project, where it's located, what's on the site, are there any endangered species, are there streams, is the site contaminated, is the project a public school, and so on and so forth. Let's begin with a federal law and then discuss the related agency. The Clean Air Act of 1970 is a federal law that regulates all sources of air emissions across the U.S. The goal is to protect the public health and environment by establishing National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or NAAQS, for common pollutants found in the air. That's a law, which started as an act. But who ensures that this law is implemented? The Clean Air Act provides the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency authority to address pollution problems that emerge over time. You might think, this is all good, but what does this have to do with my building project? You see, the Clean Air Act establishes minimum national standards for air quality, but assigns primary responsibility to the states to assure compliance with these standards. And there are many standards. Here in California, for example, the state agency that regulates air pollution is the California Environmental Protection Agency, a distinct agency at the state level. Under Cal EPA umbrella, there are many different programs, divisions, and one of those is the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. Cal EPA reports directly to the governor's office in the executive branch of the California state government. So CARB is a division of Cal EPA, and Cal EPA reports to the state government. At the state level, CARB is in charge of ensuring that as a state, we meet the US EPA standards for clean air. But CARB decided to divide its responsibility even further. CARB regulates mobile emissions in California, that is, air pollution from vehicles. The other half of the coin is emissions from stationary sources that are regulated at the local level. In fact, there are some 35 local air quality management districts. We call these AQMDs, who are responsible for enforcing regulations relating to stationary sources or emissions in our building facilities. These local districts issue permits to limit the amount of pollution that these facilities will generate. If you're involved in a residential project with diesel generators or gas stations, factories, power plants, and more, you'll have to likely apply for a permit to ensure that your building project complies with local, state, and federal air quality guidelines. If you found this video useful, please give it a thumbs up and consider giving a super thanks of any amount. I'd really appreciate it. It helps the channel greatly. Thanks again, and let's continue. Then there are other laws that dictate the involvement of specific agencies that are going to be based on your building type or your project. For example, all public schools, public primary, secondary, and community colleges are regulated by an act called the Field Act. This is a really common law to be familiar with if you're ever going to build a public school. The Field Act is California state law, which can be found in the Education Code. It is one of the first pieces of legislation that mandated earthquake-resistant construction for public schools. As I've mentioned in previous videos, many building laws came about because we lost a lot of lives and property, sadly. But in 1933, a Long Beach earthquake destroyed nearly 70 schools, damaged 120 others, and caused minor damage to some 300 more schools. The Field Act today has very stringent requirements for both structural and non-structural components in your building, especially for new construction and existing renovations, alterations, and additions. So now that we understand the law, let's discuss who regulates to oversee this act. The State Department of General Services under the Division of the State Architect, or DSA, requires that building professionals submit their plans and specifications to DSA. And it requires that DSA review and approve any building project before it gets constructed. It also requires continuous inspection through construction to ensure that the building complies with the approved drawings and specifications. The Field Act has been proven very successful here in California, allowing public schools in modern earthquakes to perform more resilient than ever. Here's yet a third example of another law that will govern your project. Usually, when a project gets submitted to the planning department, they will provide you with some sort of questionnaire or checklist to understand if any specific laws are triggered in the process of constructing your building. In California, every project gets vetted for whether it triggers a law called Squa, or the California Environmental Quality Act. It is California's broadest environmental law. Squa helps to guide the city or county department during issuance of permits and approval of projects. The courts have interpreted Squa to afford the fullest protection of the environment. Squa is not an agency. Remember that. Squa is not an agency, but it's an act or a law. Squa is regulated under the California Natural Resources Agency. Here's what the website says about the California Natural Resources Agency. The Secretary for the Natural Resources Agency consults with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, or OPR, to periodically adopt, amend, and repeal Squa guidelines. The Squa guidelines elaborate on the requirements found in the Public Resources Code. The entirety of the Squa guidelines are found in Title 14 of the California Code of Regulations, starting in Section 15,000. So there you have it. I've given you 3 examples of agencies and how they work at different levels. There are laws at all levels. At the state level, these laws can be found in the California Constitution, which is made up of 29 different codes, as you see here on the screen. Building laws are spread out throughout these codes. The Business and Professions Code, for example, is where you find the Architects Practice Act, APA, which regulates how architecture is practiced in California. The Field Act that we mentioned earlier is found here in the Education Code, or EDC. The California Fish and Game Code is where you find state policies on things like endangered species, plants, and wildlife. If you find any of these on your own site, then you will have to consult with this section of the code. The Health and Safety Code is where you find requirements for things like retail food facilities and the Hospital Seismic Safety Act, which regulates acute care facilities to ensure that hospitals remain standing and operational after a major earthquake. We've discussed federal, state, and regional agencies, but let's briefly touch on local agencies. Every city and county, as we know, adopts its own zoning designations and restrictions. Each city and county has its own departments in planning and building and safety, and these departments will regulate very specific aspects of a building project. These include the fire department, who checks for things like whether your project has proper fire access to access the building in case of a fire, or your police department, who checks for things like site lighting and security. Here's a list of some of the main departments you might find in your city or county. And then one step further are the boards within your city and county, which are established to regulate even more specific aspects of a building project. For example, a citizens advisory board made up of local community members can comment on all kinds of issues on projects. The architectural review board can comment on the architectural style of your project and whether it fits in with the goals of that local jurisdiction. Here's a list of examples for types of boards at the local level. How and where do you begin with all of this? It's really best to start at the local level and inquire with your local planning and building and safety department about the various laws that can get triggered by your project, and work with a local architect who has demonstrated that they can navigate these processes. The local triggers will most often have a domino effect and potentially require a regional, state, or even a federal agency. But again, start at the local level. Hopefully this video has provided you with a background about what these extra rules are on a building project, where do they stem from, and how are they different from your state building and zoning codes. These extra rules are regulated by federal, state, regional, and sometimes local agencies, departments, programs, and boards. Remember, building codes protect life and property at the building level. Zoning codes protect life and property at the site and adjacent site level. And these extra rules that we've discussed in this video protect life and property at a mixture of both your building, site, and city level. Let's review what we've learned in this video, and you can place your answers in the comments below. Describe the additional rules related to a building project in California, and what kinds of things can these rules regulate? Number 2, which agency regulates stationary sources of air pollution? Number 3, which act regulates earthquake-resistant design for public schools K through 14 in California? Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, then I think you may enjoy a video that I will link here all about building codes and how they work, and another one here all about zoning codes and how they work.